Jodie Wilson, it is such a great honour to introduce you. You're a wonderful friend. Jodie is a dedicated disruptive influence, author and autism researcher at La Trobe University. What do you get when you combine autism, ADHD, acquired physical disability, an award-winning veterinary career, a master's in applied positive psychology, which is where Jodie and I met, an insatiable curiosity, and a complete disregard for contextual knowledge boundaries? Well, you get the wonderful Jodie. Jodie describes herself as a talented overthinker who can talk underwater, is a fan of explicit communication, and thinks unexamined social rules are stupid. Through research, writing, and speaking, Jodie challenges assumptions and redesigns systems that weren't built for minds, wonderful minds like hers. So please, everyone, welcome Jodie Wilson.
Thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. I will try to live up to it. Oh, there I am. Cool. For anybody who needs a visual description, I'm a middle-aged white woman. I'm wearing glasses, a blue blouse with a floral border print, and purple pants with butterflies on the hem. White platform sneakers, and I walk with a walking stick, which is purple. As Sarah said, my name's Jodie Wilson, and I'm here to talk about disruption. Not the wild, spontaneous, break everything for fun type of disruption, but the dedicated, purposeful, ethical, and often entirely inconvenient sort of disruption. I'm going to start by disrupting your understanding of showing your appreciation. In Australia, our social norms around applause aren't very inclusive. For many members of the neurodivergent community, the noise of clapping can be a huge sensory challenge. It's also not terribly inclusive for members of the deaf and hard of hearing community. So I want to make this as inclusive a space as possible for everyone. And I thought I'd start today by teaching you how to applaud in Auslan, Australian Sign Language. Does anybody already know how to applaud in Auslan? Yeah. So I'm going to ask you today to raise your hands, big waves when you're ready to applaud. And we'll see. I still forget, so I don't expect you to remember all the time, but as many times as we can, if we can remember to applaud in Auslan, that would be wonderful. Okay, my autistic brain is happy now that we've talked about that. So when we're applauding presenters, we often will start with the clap, and that's okay, but we're going to move to the Auslan sign when we can. It's a relatively small step for inclusion, but inclusion is made of many, many, many small steps. It's something I've learnt in the last few years as I've started to play more in spaces for inclusion. Until I was 40, I literally spent my whole life in veterinary practices. I grew up above a veterinary clinic. My dad was a vet. The clinic was downstairs. Our family lived upstairs. It was a perfect early education in systems. People, patients, chaos, compassion, all operating in a feedback loop that was fueled by instant coffee. I was hooked, and I went to vet school too. Fast forward more than a few decades, and other than the instant coffee being replaced by espresso, I saw those same systems struggling to support me as the senior veterinarian in Australia's busiest small animal emergency practice. Given that's my background, you sort of might be wondering why I'm standing up front here today. Well, the first 40 years of my life took place in veterinary context, the veterinary adjacent context. Something happened in my early 40s that changed my understanding of the world. Several things happened. I finished a Master of Applied Positive Psychology at Melbourne Uni. I was diagnosed as autistic, ADHD, with a couple of specific learning disorders, several flavours of PTSD, and I acquired a career-ending physical disability. As a result, I walked away from an award-winning veterinary career. Career-ending disability probably sounds like something that I shouldn't say standing up the front here, talking about inclusion. And I think I need to acknowledge that it's actually very much a misrepresentation of what happened. I acquired a chronic pain condition, poor balance and coordination, and restricted mobility. I use a walking stick and I'm a part-time wheelchair user. And I'm a part-time wheelchair user because, like most disability, mine is dynamic. It changes from day to day, and I often have very little impact or choice in how I am able to function for the day. But importantly, disability didn't end my veterinary career. The systems and structures of the industry that I was a part of were what ended my veterinary career. Those same systems that struggled to support me when I was physically able, they collapsed under the demand load of complex intersectional inclusion. And this is what I find interesting. Those systems weren't broken. They were doing exactly what they were designed to do. The problem is, like many default systems, they weren't designed to support diversity, complexity, or difference. Now, I don't want you to worry. My veterinary career might have ended, but I accidentally got a job as an autism researcher, so I'm still gainfully employed. I now spend part of my time at the Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre at La Trobe Uni, and I'm part of the research team, and we research, operationalise and implement change for neuro-inclusion across a wide range of industries. I also lead a team of rebels at Disruptive, and our team's shared purpose is to make the world a more inclusive place by any means necessary. And along the way, through multiple iterations of veterinary practice, from cows to dogs and cats, from palliative care and hospice through to emergency and critical care, as well as in my research and inclusion work, I've learned a little something about systems, disruption, and design. Now, here's what I believe. As uncomfortable as it is, most of the systems that we operate in aren't designed for the full range of humans who use them. They've evolved around a narrow idea of normal, what researchers call normative expectations. And everyone else is simply unconsidered. That's where disruption comes in. Not rebellion for its own sake, but for purposeful redesign. We're going to play... Nope, sorry. Oh, we are at big ideas, sorry. We're going to play with some big ideas over the next 40 minutes or so. And if you're an intensely curious individual like I am, you're going to want to know more about them, more than I can possibly share with you in that tiny little bit of time. Don't worry, I've got you. At the end of the presentation, I'll share a QR code, and you can download some of our handouts. Some of them are infographics, but they're all also available as plain text. And you can learn a little bit more about those big ideas and how you might be able to use them to disrupt systems for inclusion. One of the reasons that we're happy to share that information freely is because inclusion begins with shared language. Learning theory tells us that literacy precedes competence. Precise and explicit shared language is the first step towards true inclusion. Shared language allows us to develop shared mental models, and this shared understanding allows us to have meaningful discussions. We can engage in true collaboration, and we can establish shared accountability. When we take the time to develop shared mental models, we're embedding precision. If we don't have shared mental models, we embed confusion, not inclusion. So when you download the handouts, you can use them to develop as shortcuts to develop shared mental models with other people at your workplace or at your home or at your school. The explicit and deliberate development of shared mental models is a really good practice to embed, and it's essential both in my research work and in my inclusion work at Disruptive, when my team designs tools for inclusion. Our tools often come out looking something like this, and sharing this neatly packaged end product sometimes feels a bit disingenuous to me because it really misrepresents the process it took to get there. And this one is a great example of that. It's a simple, straightforward, explicit, one-page tool that enables questions to be asked and answered atraumatically. And it comes from a process that looks a bit like poorly drawn chaos. It's messy and complex and iterative, and it takes a whole community to make it work. This particular tool, the Clarifying Questions Framework, took a team of 5 people and a community of 60 volunteers 6 months to make. The process felt like anarchy, fueled by adrenaline, ADHD, meds and caffeine. And there's no better way to design inclusion that meets the needs of users. The process we use is called human-centred design, and it's changed the way I approach almost everything that I do. At its heart, human-centred design is about designing with people, not at them. And traditional systems rely heavily on technical or academic expertise, which is important, and it's incomplete. Lived experience is essential expertise when we're designing inclusion. When we combine research evidence with the perspectives of those most impacted by our designs, we see essential patterns, barriers, and components that we'd otherwise miss. So if human-centred design is the be-all and end-all, why isn't everyone embracing it? I suspect it's because human-centred design demands a shift in approach from business as usual. It requires us to have the courage to ask really difficult questions of ourselves and of others, and a commitment to keep going and keep trying until we get it right. Let's have a look at another couple of big ideas and where they might fit in the human-centred design cycle. So human-centred design starts with understanding the people we're designing for and with. When I acquired my physical disability and limped away from my career as an emergency vet, I needed something else to do, and I thought maybe I could leverage the Masters in Pos Psych and learn something about autistic wellbeing. So during my first Zoom meeting with a potential supervisor, my current boss accidentally offered me a job. And I started off organising some data for him and ended up leading an international team investigating the experiences of autistic adults engaging with mental health support services. The nuanced understanding we were able to generate from that research is changing the way healthcare professionals interact with autistic clients. Because it turns out that lived experience researchers can make a difference in terms of research participants being truly understood. In the same vein, lived experience informing inclusion is essential. In my new research career, I learnt that examining identity is a really important thing for researchers, especially qualitative researchers like me, to do. Our identities inform what we do and don't know about the world, and if they're unexamined, so are the assumptions that underpin our positionality and approaches. As a translational researcher, I'm expected to examine and make explicit and public my positionality and theoretical assumptions because they impact the information I produce. Outside of research, though, we're rarely required to make our positionality explicit. What might happen if, as designers, this was part of our design practice? What might change? Here's my take on it. Effective inclusive design requires examined identity. If your sense of self is unexamined, your behaviours and assumptions default to unexamined norms. And social norms, especially invisible ones, are where exclusion hides. Okay, we're there. Contributing to the dangers of unexamined norms are the hundreds of cognitive biases and distortions embedded in human development. And this one is particularly relevant to inclusion. The false consensus bias is the tendency to overestimate how much other people share our beliefs, values, preferences, and experiences. If our society's systems, structures, and built environments are designed by people who assume that everybody else experiences the world the same way they do, then they'll design systems that work best for people exactly like them. A young friend of mine is an architecture student, and he told me the story of a classmate who was lucky enough to be involved in designing a new accessible school. His friend was really surprised when the experienced designers working on the project centred stairs rather than ramps as the default access to every building. This is the false consensus bias in action. Without critical appraisal of positionality and beliefs, we default to normative standards. And we add accessible design as an afterthought in our systems, even when we understand the universal design principles. Human-centred design asks us to engage with users to understand barriers and redesign our systems to meet nuanced need and embed equity and accessibility. But how can we approach effectively understanding people who aren't the same as us when we don't know what we don't know? In human medicine, healthcare professionals are becoming increasingly aware of the uneven power dynamics of the relationship between patient and caregiver. And many human health organisations are turning to an approach of cultural humility to offset that imbalance. Now, cultural humility involves an ongoing commitment by healthcare professionals to learning, reflection, and improvement in interactions, especially interactions with people who may have significantly different cultural or language identities to them. It aims to reduce the power imbalance and centres each patient as the expert in their own life and experiences. I think we can extend the reach of cultural humility beyond both the healthcare and geopolitical applications, and we can use it as the antidote to the false consensus bias when we're designing inclusion. An approach of cultural humility allows us to understand that we don't know what we don't know. And when we engage in human-centred design for needs that differ from our own, it encourages us to talk to the people who do know. It lets us discover what equity might look like for a diverse range of human beings. And it stops us from treating people as unreliable witnesses to their own lives. Cultural humility lets us incorporate co-designed equity solutions that really meet people's needs. And after we get to know our users, the second step in the human-centred design cycle is to define the challenge we're trying to overcome, the barrier we're trying to remove or accommodate. We often treat accessibility as a built environment issue and inclusion as a people and culture issue. They're actually two sides of the same coin. The built environment and the social environment constantly reinforce each other. A step without a ramp at the doorway says you're not welcome just as loudly as forced eye contact in a classroom does. This is where systems thinking comes in. Systems create what they're designed to create. You can't train a system to be inclusive. You have to redesign the conditions that shape the system's behaviour. Systems thinking helps us to zoom out to see relationships and feedback loops instead of isolated issues. And systems mapping makes those patterns visible. It draws the connections between behaviour, structure and outcome. And when we're informed by lived and living experience to map our systems, we can start to truly understand where the barriers might be hiding. Once you can see the barriers, you can design them out of the system. If we aren't informed by lived experience, sometimes our inclusion efforts might embed barriers that we don't even know exist. I'm going to share a secret with you. I collect inclusion barriers and the stories behind them as one of my weird autistic special interests. They fascinate me and bewilder me in equal part. Both the fascination and bewilderment arise from the fact that most people who erect these barriers are trying very hard to be inclusive. I'm going to share a couple that I've collected recently. So this sign was on the door of the accessible bathroom in a building that houses multiple disability service providers: occupational therapy, physio, speech pathology, psychology and more. And it was made by a well-meaning staff member who wanted to stop the public from misusing the space. Lovely intent, terrible execution. Requiring people to request a key creates barriers only for those who already face the greatest cognitive and physical load. It forces disclosure. It adds extra steps to meet a basic need, and it signals that accessibility must be justified. It's othering disguised as inclusion, and it's a reminder that good design isn't just about good intention, but it's about equitable access without extra permission. This photo of the accessible parking at my local supermarket shows construction fencing placed directly over the accessible parking bays. No temporary accessible parking is provided. It's a simple oversight, but it has significant consequences. When accessible parking is removed without replacement, people with mobility or respiratory health conditions are effectively excluded from accessing this space. It signals that accessibility is optional, something to be suspended when it's inconvenient. It's not. It's a fundamental design and legislative requirement. Again, not about intent, about impact. Accessibility isn't a nice-to-have feature of the built environment. It's a baseline condition of equity and participation. This photo was taken at my son's primary school last week. A campus of 300 pupils with only one accessible parking space for the whole school community to share. There's no accessible street parking anywhere nearby. And when air conditioning repairs were needed, guess where the tradies parked their trailer? And once again, we get the message that accessibility is negotiable, a convenience, not a commitment. True inclusion means thinking ahead so that access isn't the first thing to go when space gets tight. And a few weeks ago, this staircase stood between me, a part-time wheelchair user, and my 7-year-old son's end-of-season soccer presentation. The building has a lift, but it was locked because it was after hours despite the club holding the event there. No one could find the key, so I sat at the bottom of the stairs while other parents supervised my son and took photos for me. Another example of intent-impact mismatch, not malice, but definitely neglect. A single locked door that turned what should have been a community and family celebration into quiet exclusion. None of these examples occurred because of ill intent, but because the designers and gatekeepers of these spaces don't see the barriers they're creating. Because the voices of lived experience aren't sought out to inform design and practice. Human-centred design explicitly directs us to ensure that lived experience expertise is sought and incorporated when we're designing for inclusion. Thinking in systems means we don't just seek out the obvious, but we seek to understand the nuance of need driving our design process. The third step in human-centred design is to generate solutions. And this might need us to think or act in ways that are quite different from the accepted sociocultural norms, and look for answers outside our traditional contextual knowledge boundaries. We're aiming for disruption that leads to positive deviance, where positive deviance is based on the observation that in every collective there are certain individuals or groups whose deviant behaviours and strategies allow them to find better solutions to problems than their peers, even while they're having access to the same resources and facing similar or worse challenges. The good news for us is that we don't always have to be the originators of positively deviant solutions. Positive deviance in ideation might mean finding the people who already make the impossible work and learning from them. Instead of inventing new ideas from scratch, We study what's quietly succeeding within the same constraints. It's creativity grounded in real context. It's innovation that starts from lived experience, not imported theory. And here's a great example. People with ADHD often struggle with task initiation and sustaining attention, not because of laziness, but because the brain's self-regulation and time perception systems run on a different operating model. Traditional productivity advice, just focus harder, doesn't help, much like installing a Windows update on my Mac doesn't help, and may in fact make things worse. The solution, body doubling, is an organically grown, community-generated executive function hack for ADHD brains. Within ADHD communities, peer groups and online, people noticed that they got more done when another person was quietly in the room, or even on video. Body doubling isn't about supervision or social pressure, it's about co-regulation. The body double's presence anchors attention, externalises accountability, and reduces task avoidance through shared energy. What began as an improvised community workaround spread globally. It's now recognised in ADHD coaching, occupational therapy, and neuroaffirming psychology practice as an effective self-management tool. Body doubling is a great example of how lived experience can out-innovate formal systems of expertise. It's a classic case of positive deviance, people in the same context discovering success by doing things differently. Once we're good at positive deviance, stage 4 of the human-centred design process, the cycle, tells us that we need to prototype and test our positively deviant solutions. Now, we've already acknowledged that thinking in systems is essential to our process, and we're going to take it a step further and flirt a little bit with systems theory and chaos theory. The reason we're going to do that is to help us understand why prototype and test is a non-negotiable and has to be included when we're designing for inclusion. In systems theory, a system is a set of interacting pieces that combine and act for a common purpose. And for those of you unfamiliar with systems theory, there are a couple of systems principles that are essential to our conversations today. The first is an understanding of the difference between a complex system and a complicated system. A complicated system has lots of moving parts. They're interrelated and they work together. The petrol engine in a car is a great example of a complicated system. Lots of different parts, interrelated and interconnected, acting for a common purpose to produce energy and movement. You can shut down and restart a complicated system, although it might take a multi-step and precise protocol to do it. If you follow the steps, it works again once it's restarted. In this complicated system, parts are also interchangeable. If you take out an essential cog and replace it with the same size cog, the system will perform like you expect it to. If you take out an essential cog and replace it with a different size cog, you can still predict with a reasonable degree of accuracy how that's going to impact the system's behaviour. A complicated system is relatively predictable, even when we make changes. A complex system, in contrast, is far less predictable. Complex systems are systems where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. In my research, the fact that people exist in complex systems and are themselves complex systems comes up again and again. Why do I define humans as complex systems? Well, we meet all the criteria. If you take out an essential part, even if you replace it with one the same size and shape, it won't always work the same way. If you switch a person off, you can't always turn them back on again, even if you follow the protocol to the letter. Possibly the most relevant thing about complex systems in terms of design is that complex systems are often unpredictable to the point where we apply chaos theory to their behaviours. The butterfly effect is one of the core concepts of chaos theory. In the early 60s, a mathematician and meteorologist named Edward Lorenz was applying chaos theory to weather predictions. And in one of the resulting publications, Lorenz asked the question, does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? And let me save you from hours of Googling. No one knows the answer. It's a metaphor. And it's a metaphor for the chaos phenomenon properly called sensitive dependence on initial conditions. It's an accessible way for non-chaos theory experts, people like you and me, to understand the idea. The butterfly effect describes how a small, seemingly insignificant change in one part of a complex system can trigger a cascade of events that eventuate in an unexpected and disproportionate outcome in a distant part of the system. And if that doesn't describe neurodivergent life to a T, I don't know what does. What it tells us in terms of human-centred design is that when we apply our solutions to the complex systems of human beings, those solutions may have unexpected results. For that reason, it's essential that we prototype and test before deciding on a final solution. Of course, there's no point testing without seeking feedback and adjusting and trying again till we get it right. And the big idea that fits best in this step is positive failure. Positive failure practice treats mistakes and failures as data, not disaster. Instead of hiding what didn't work, we examine it with curiosity and we use it to guide the next iteration. When teams are safe to experiment, reflect and adjust, failure becomes a feedback loop. It's the engine of learning that drives better design, innovation and inclusion. And everyone in the Disruptive design team aims to be a positive failure practitioner. And we've made explicit our company norms around failure to support that. And we understand that failure is essential to the process of innovation. The design of elegant, flexible solutions to embed inclusion requires commitment and stamina. And when we're flagging in that design process, positive failure practices remind us that iteration is the love language of inclusion. Once we have a successful prototype that incorporates the chaos and feedback of real-world users, the sixth step in the human-centred design process asks us to implement our solutions. Yay, right? I've got some good news and some bad news about that. This is the part of the human-centred design cycle that can be the hardest. By this stage, we've got a well-tested, finely crafted, robust and workable solution. So what's the problem? Often it's those pesky socio-cultural norms, the social rules, often unwritten, even unspoken, that govern normative expectations of behaviour. They're embedded in the very bones of society and they are completely made up. And they're often really harmful to anybody who doesn't embody the current perception of normative. Sociocultural norms are also often the treasure that change opponents decide they must defend from the marauding dragon of inclusion. As a result, to implement inclusion, we sometimes need to be a little bit or a lot naughty. I'm going to invite you all to play in my sandpit, where we plan disruption, revel in the chaos, and where we're not afraid to break the rules to embed inclusion in the world. We destabilise systems and harness the resulting entropy to power the change we need to see. It is hard and dangerous work, so I think you probably need to start training right now. And practice small acts of ethical insubordination before you build up to big ones. As part of your training, it's essential that you understand the steps for ethical rule breaking and train the muscles of insubordination until you're performance ready. Think of it as dance practice for disruption. Know the choreography, start with a few steps and build up to the whole routine. To be safely and ethically disobedient, we need to know ourselves. We need to know our strengths, to be honest about our weaknesses, and to know our own values, to understand what our non-negotiables are. We also need to have a good understanding of what the dance floor looks like. What is the system that we're trying to disrupt? What does business as usual look like? What are the costs of inaction? And how can you approach disruption compassionately and collaboratively? And how can you make sure that the cost of your disobedience falls only on those who consent to pay it and can afford to do so? Because make no mistake, there is always a cost to be paid for insubordination. If we're prepared to be as disobedient as needed, we complete our design cycle and we can start again to tackle any inclusion challenges that arise from or are unearthed by our principled insubordination. I can see some disappointed faces out there in the audience. You thought I was going to give you the nitty-gritty and let you be naughty right now, didn't you? Okay. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the case study that I'm going to use includes reference to intimate partner violence and injury to an animal. So please take a moment to check in with yourself. If you need to step out or take a break, that's completely fine. No offence will ever be taken. My aim with this case study isn't to shock you, but to give you a clear, straightforward example to train the muscle of disobedience. A way to explore how design, whether of spaces, systems or policies, can either support or silence ethical action. And how sometimes the wrong thing is the only right thing to do. We're going to give anybody who needs to step out a minute or two to do that, and then we'll start. In the meantime, if you're going to stay, I'd like you to take the opportunity to meet your neighbour. And if you're comfortable sharing, tell them the story of the most disobedient thing you have ever done. I'll set the timer for 2 minutes. Okay, we might bring it back. Excellent. Have we learnt some things about each other? Is this a room skilled in disobedience? Was anybody shocked by the story they heard? No, don't tell me. All right, so let's play with the fire. I'm going to set the scene for you. It's 2 a.m. on an Easter Sunday. You're an emergency veterinarian and your 12-hour shift has blown out to 14 hours. You're finishing up your notes and you're almost ready to clock off. The clinic's finally quiet, the hospital manager's gone home, and the overnight vet's just taken over and is supposed to see any new cases that come in. One of the front of house team approaches you and says softly, "I know you've finished consulting, but can you see the next one? It seems complicated." The owner is a young woman and she's holding an 11-week-old puppy that weighs less than a kilo, some sort of Chihuahua mix. The client has old bruises and fresh burns. and a demeanour that clearly spells trauma. The puppy can't lift his head and he screams every time he tries to move. She insists that she fell while making a cup of tea and landed on the puppy. But her story doesn't really add up. This is the kind of moment that design rarely anticipates. The policy manual can tell you how to invoice a client, but not what to do when compassion collides with compliance. Eventually, she admits her partner threw boiling water at her and threw the puppy forcefully against the wall. She's financially controlled, afraid to take the puppy home. To add to the complexity, consenting to humane euthanasia for this client is simply not an option. She declines referral to a domestic violence support service and says she has to go home because the mama dog and another puppy are still there and she's terrified for their safety. She begs to surrender the puppy, whose name is Basil, so you can help him. She's desperate and she's in despair. The hospital policy says no surrenders under any circumstances. There's no domestic violence policy to guide you. You try all the phone numbers for all the management level people and nobody answers. You can feel the weight of the system. It's designed for tidy transactions. It assumes safety, stability, and the absence of non-medical crisis. And you're standing right there in that gap between what's written and what's right. Take a minute or two now and talk with your neighbour again about what you might need to think about to plan your pathway forward in this situation. What do you need to think about to consider what your next action should be? If you have any clarifying questions, you can ask me and I'll answer what I can. So let's take 2 minutes and see what we need to know. Yes. Have we got a microphone for questions? So if you've got any questions, throw your hand up and I'll answer them.
Just a quick question. Can the puppy be saved?
Sorry.
Just a quick question. Can the puppy be saved?
Yes, so the puppy, we haven't done any diagnostics yet because the client has zero money and we work for someone else. So with zero money on board, we can't do anything at this point.
That's physically possible. So.
As looking at the puppy, I think it's worth doing the diagnostics if we can. Okay. Thank you. So how did you go? Did you think about some things that might impact your next actions? Did you consider the owner of the puppy, how your next actions might impact her? And Basil, your tiny patient? What about the other animals living at home? What personal cost might you be inviting? And how do you make sure that cost doesn't fall on others? If you consider those things, can you think of a positively deviant pathway forward? Take another minute, talk to your neighbours, and see if you can finalise a plan for what to do next. I'll give you a minute. Okay. These are some of the things we talked about before. Did they inform your plan? Yeah. Do you feel confident in your path forward? Is anyone brave enough to tell me what their plan is? Okay, there we go.
Hi, my name's James. I'm from the University of Melbourne, and just as a positionality statement, I'm someone who respects systems and respects authority, so this answer might be a bit uncomfortable. So I guess in terms of from a ethical insubordination perspective, I'd probably be doing the diagnosis because the diagnosis is cheaper than the treatment, but then because of protocols, I'd have to actually give the puppy back to the patient and send them off home because I'm pretty much restricted by the systems and I have to state that. Having said that, I would probably advise the owner to actually come back to the hospital when they're able and we can treat the puppy by then.
Okay.
Hello, Megan. I'm an access consultant and autistic, so I don't really follow rules that well. So I'd be taking the puppy and I'd be inviting the person to come back the next day and bring the dog and the other puppy and deal with the consequences of all of that.
Okay. And look, neither of those answers is wrong. I guess this is the point. There's no wrong answers. Got time for maybe two more, that one and that one. This one first.
I'm Dagmar, Sydney University. My main concern is actually for the lady. So I would try to sit down with her, give her a cup of tea and try to find either a number for domestic violence to link her at least to that number. And then potentially also maybe find her consent to send police over to retrieve the other animals, which might be a bit more of a larger theme.
Yeah.
Sorry, and of course I would treat the puppy. I think there's no question wrong.
Hi, is this on? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm the new owner of Basil the puppy. That's the veterinarian. That's my dog forever now. No, I'd be really considering, I know I'm someone that will go against policy and things like that to help someone and an animal. But I'd also be thinking about, okay, are there minors in the house with this abusive person? And yes, that animal cruelty is illegal too, and that does qualify. So what are we going to do to protect those animals in a way that keeps this person safe? That's what I'd be thinking about. And Basil and I live happily ever after. He lives till he's 15 and he has a really good life. Thank you.
Excellent. So, when we do the diagnostics, Basil has a broken neck and 2 broken front legs. His broken neck is a soft fracture, so an atlantoaxial dislocation. There's a step. The only thing holding his head on his spine is the musculature. It's not a simple fix. The owner... Sorry.
Additional context question. Is there an emergency ward in the hospital?
There's nothing in place that would allow you to admit this puppy without to not break the rules. You can't admit the puppy. So if you've made sure you know who you are, what you're dealing with, and you've considered the potential cost, any action that you take is viable action. This is one way it could go. You buy the puppy from the owner with a handwritten bill of sale using whatever cash you could scrounge from the bottom of your work bag. You pay for the puppy's treatment yourself, and you help the client make plans for her other pets to go to a friend's place where they'll be safe. She still says no to referral, and you're aware that the data around domestic violence says that it takes victims of domestic violence around 7 attempts to leave an abusive partner. And if there are animal or children hostages, it takes more goes than that. So you know you're breaking policy, but you also know that you're protecting life and living your values as a human being. You've considered the owner, the patient, other animals at home. Now you need to do everything you can to reduce collateral damage and make sure that the cost of insubordination falls on you alone. How do you do that? Well, the next morning you call your manager before she finds out from someone else. You confess and accept a formal reprimand on your HR file, and because you spoke up, the hospital writes its first domestic violence policy. This is ethical insubordination in action, the deliberate choice to defy an inadequate rule in service of a higher ethical truth. It's not rebellion for ego's sake. It's putting moral courage into practice. So, as a positive failure practitioner, I want to learn from every scenario. And this is my question. How could the system, the workplace, the policy, the culture have supported the right decision so it didn't require breaking the rules? Along the same lines, how might we design learning environments, workplaces and professional cultures that anticipate moral complexity? Because this might be a pretty black and white example, but I don't know anybody who doesn't face some level of moral complexity in their professional roles. How do we build in discretion, trust and psychological safety? How do we teach people how to act ethically when the policy hasn't caught up yet? I think it's really important to remember that inclusion is one of the measures of ethical integrity. For designers, educators, architects, this is more than a veterinary story. We can think of it as a design brief about humanity to remind us that that moral complexity is there. And our systems and spaces, whether built environment, procedural or sociocultural, either enable ethical action or inhibit it. And if they inhibit it, they also inhibit inclusion, and people are forced to choose between compassion and compliance. Basil recovered. 6 years later, he still lives with the veterinarian who's autistic. Or 15. With the veterinarian whose autistic hyperempathy meant she had to break the rules. And he's a small doggo whose survival reminds us that sometimes systems fail and that as humans we can be the design elements that hold the moral structure together until we can rebuild the systems. I invite you to break the rules you need to break to make the world a better place. And I want us to start today, where we are right now, and design and rebuild our systems with technical expertise and lived experience expertise working together for an inclusive future. I can't wait to see where we go. Thank you. And that's the QR code for the download. Oh, thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Jodie. I think you've taken us on quite a magical journey and set us some terrific challenges. We don't have a lot of time, but I'm sure there are questions. Slido or hands up, and we'll get some microphones around. I'll look at I've left the Slido here. Does anyone have a question they want to ask in person? Beyond the puppy, which was a fantastic challenge. Oh, here we go. All right, let me have a quick look. What are we interested in? I'll just read the first one. Just because you have lived experience, it doesn't mean you're innately inclusive. How do we encourage questioning of bias in our lived experience?
I think that's a really good question, and it's something that we face a lot. When we go into hospitals, whether human medicine or veterinary hospitals for inclusion, we often find that the biggest challenges are between people who may have the same diagnosis but are unaware that the experience of a condition is very different from one person to another. And especially when we're talking about neurodivergence, there's a saying that autism researchers have: if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Autism is the most heterogeneous cognitive condition, and autistic profiles are as individual as fingerprints. Again, that false consensus bias comes in, and if we engage with cultural humility to remember that we don't know what we don't know, and that every individual is the expert in their own life and experiences, it lets us make space for that difference. We also talk a lot about intersectionality, and intersectional inclusion is probably the most important thing we can consider. And when we talk about intersectional inclusion with people who may not understand that that's an issue, sometimes it can make them aware that their experience can be different from someone else's experience because of those intersections.
There's another question here about, you mentioned the cost of ethical insubordination. Can you share one cost that you've had to pay?
Basil's CT and hospital treatment cost me $3,500. Thank you. But not just that. Things like when I rang my boss to tell her what I'd done, she was like, I don't know what to do with this, Jodie. And so I suggested that she escalated it to HR because I'd broken a rule and I didn't want her to have to bear the cost. So one of the costs of ethical insubordination is often determining that you need to be punished for it in terms of rule breaking. And I think it's something that we need to accept. If we work somewhere where the rules are clear and we break them, we have to accept that there's a cost for that. And a note on my HR file, experienced veterinarians are in short supply. It was never going to be a problem for me.
The risks weren't that great. Look, I've been pointed out that we're actually well over time. I think we've got so much to talk about over lunch. So we will move to lunch. Again, with Auslan, can you please thank Jodie for sharing such a wonderful set of stories with us and a great framework for us to all consider in our own work.